Welcome to Huddle Up with Matias Bueno. We're back to the CFL, and today our guest here to talk with us about one of the most iconic teams to win the Grey Cup in CFL history is the play-by-play voice and the communications manager of the Toronto Argonauts, Mike Hogan. Mike, thanks for joining me today. I'm really glad to talk Argos football with you.
Thanks for asking me. Love doing it.
So let's get to the good stuff right away. It is 2022, and for technicality's sake, we can say with the missed season that this last year or season upcoming was the 30th anniversary in terms of seasons of the 1991 Grey Cup champion Toronto Argonauts. Now, if the listener may not be aware, this team goes deeper than just the glitz and glamour you saw on CBC back in the early 90s, and it goes deeper than seeing Rocket Ishmael's kick return touchdown 100 times on TSN. This team really embodied everything about Canadian royalty, and its significance in pop culture should not be glossed over. What were your initial thoughts when the ownership group of John Candy, Bruce McNall, and Wayne Gretzky came together to purchase the club in 1991?
Holy crap. And I cleaned that up. It was astonishing. John Candy was an icon in this country for television, for the old SCTV days. He was as popular as any comedian in the country, whether it be American or Canadian. He was that big. And Wayne Gretzky was Wayne Gretzky. He was probably the most popular Canadian, even unless you were a Calgary Flames fan or a Winnipeg Jets fan. People loved watching Gretzky play. If you're a Leaf fan, Hab fan, whatever, a fan of the New York Rangers, ooh, it's Gretzky. What's he doing? And he had that kind of mantle that I don't think any Canadian athlete has right now. So the fact that those two were coming to town with a guy that nobody had heard of in Bruce McNall, it was, what is going to happen to this team? And we found out pretty quickly that it wasn't just on the field, but we were going to find out it was going to be the off-field stuff as well. It did become a very trendy, very cool thing to do in Toronto in 91.
Looking at the makeup of that roster, you see guys like Pinball Clemens was at the beginning of his career, Matt Dunnigan, who had a ton of flair, similar to a Brian Bosworth, but actually was successful in the at quarterback. You look at Rocket Ishmael, the man, the $1 million man, as they say, was brought in, was supposed to go in the first round of the NFL draft, but was given a 4-year, $18 million contract to come and play in the Canadian Football League. What was hearing that news like? I can only imagine if maybe not Tom Brady, but if the best skilled position player in the NFL played the CFL today, that would just make the world explode, I think.
Rocket Ismail wasn't going to be a first rounder. He was going to be the number 1 overall pick in the NFL draft. And you put that number out there, $4.5 million American is what he was making. So you can even say in Canadian dollars, he was making more than that. But it's just to compare it. The highest paid receiver in the NFL was Jerry Rice, who was making $1 million a year. Rocket Ismail was making 4.5 times what Jerry Rice was being paid. The highest paid player at the time was Joe Montana. I forget what his dollar value was, but Rocket Ismail was making more than Joe Montana. He was the highest paid football player on the planet, and he was playing for the Toronto Argonauts. It was a deal that really he and his group couldn't say no to. He wasn't going to get that kind of money in the NFL, and he blew the doors off everybody. And when it was officially announced that morning, it just blew up in the United States. Chris Berman was the host of ESPN who was covering the draft that day. And he said, the Rockets going north. And just in the United States, and this was pre-Twitter, just everybody went insane because nobody could believe that Rocket Ismail was heading to the CFL.
Could you imagine what that would have been like if this was in the age of the internet? People were freaking out over Tom Brady coming out of retirement. Now imagine if the person who was supposed to go first overall, a beloved prospect, bona fide generational talent, headed to the CFL. People now love to make fun of the Argos or the CFL as a whole for its how menial it seems compared to the NFL. But there's a lot of things embedded in the history of the CFL that eventually made its way down south that people shouldn't really slight against Canadian football. And especially this part of that big blanket is such a quintessential piece. The Rocket going north and the buzz towards training camp must have been crazy.
Well, here's before we get onto that, but just so people can kind of get that, and they may not believe this, but if you were to ask somebody where the first organized rules for football were established, people might say, oh, it was in the Ivy League, it was at Harvard, or it was in Green Bay or Ohio or one of the cradles of American football. No, it was at U of T. Football is a Canadian game. It's a Toronto game. So I think people may, if they want to go back in history, shake their head a little bit and say, oh, this is really part of our fabric. The Argos were celebrating our 150th anniversary in 2023. No other team in any sport can say that in North America. So there is that lineage. In terms of 91, the training camp in Guelph was just ridiculous. Everybody wanted to see the Rocket. There were news teams, sportscasts. I'm trying to think if even TSN was around. Yeah, TSN was around. So, I mean, TSN was there. Just everybody was there. And they wanted to see Rocket, and they wanted to see him run the 40. And that was the big thing, because he had run one of the fastest 40s at the Combine in the States. I think it was 4.26 or thereabouts. He was just that fast. And everybody wanted to see that. And he didn't disappoint. When he ran his first 40 in Toronto. He was just remarkable, and the buzz was just, as you can imagine. I don't know what the equivalent would be. Would it be Trevor Lawrence from a year ago? Because I don't see that, that big offensive player coming out this year. It's going to be defense and offensive lineman up at the top of the draft. So last year, number one pick in the draft. Can you imagine if Trevor Lawrence had have signed with the Argos the day of the NFL draft?
I mean, as a Jaguars fan, I can only imagine how crazy that would have been. Funny you mention that. But yeah, like, I don't even think that would be as big as the Rocket. And Lawrence was touted and it was huge. Or like Luck, if you think back even further, like maybe Michael Vick, maybe,
but it's that kind of hype. And he was an Argo, and it made every newspaper, every newscast, every sportscast, television, radio, just magazines. If it was to be talked about on both sides of the border, Rocket Ismail was the biggest sports story in North America.
Do you remember exactly where you were when you heard the news first break, and what was that setting like?
Well, the first time it kind of came out, Bruce McNall was on a Hockey Night in Canada broadcast, and he mentioned that they were going to sign Rocket Ismail. I don't think anybody believed him. And, Mike McCarthy, I had this discussion with him a year ago. He was the general manager of the Argos at the time. He said his phone blew up as people were trying to figure out if this was true. And nobody believed Bruce McNall. And nobody also believed that Wayne Gretzky would become an LA King. But Bruce McNall, who owned the Kings at the time, made that happen. Nobody thought that Gretzky was going to leave the Edmonton Oilers. Likewise, nobody thought that Rocket Ismail was going to head to Canada, and McNall made both happen. And he saw happening in Toronto with the Argos what happened in LA, which was not a good hockey market when the Kings signed Wayne Gretzky.
And even you mentioned Wayne Gretzky going to the Kings, like that. Talk to any NHL fan, like that's one of like the darkest days in the history of the Oilers. Like that whole the scenario around the trade, the visual of him crying, everything surrounding that was just like what was like just it was like a funeral. It was so dark. And you mentioned, I mean, this is also just around the age of cell phones, maybe I think starting to become more used in maybe wealthier circles, but that just everything about each step of this year-long journey with the team and the ownership just gets wilder and wilder every time. And when you think of someone like John Candy and what he meant at the time and how much of an avid, genuine CFL fan he was. Yes, we see people who clout chase as much as possible on Twitter every time that there's one sliver of a reference to the CFL. Heritage Classic being a great example. Kyle Dubas utters the words Hamilton or Tiger Cats or Toronto or Argonauts. in the same sentence, and it's automatically a news article. Like, that is just goes to show how thirsty the league is. Not to say that it's unjustified, but how thirsty they are for media attention. And this is that. Like, if six supernovas came together and collided, that's what this was like, I'm sure, back in the day, for people who weren't, conscious enough to remember this moment in CFL history.
Well, it was, and you mentioned Candy, and he was really the guy that wanted to do something big. And when the ownership group, the new ownership group, got together, they were talking about, what do we do? What do we do? What can we do? And again, it was Mike McCarthy. It was Candy who said, we got to get a big player. We've got to get that guy. And they all thought it should be a quarterback. And McCarthy said, no, I think I've got the guy. And it was Rocket Ismail, who did not win the Heisman, but was kind of the darling of college football because he was so electrifying and, had 2 punt returns for touchdowns against Miami in the biggest game of the NCAA schedule. And he was just that guy. He was the poster boy for NCAA football and came up here. But it was Candy who thought that, yeah, we need somebody. Let's get that guy. And it was McCarthy who suggested Rocket Ismail. And Candy was a legitimate Argo fan. He grew up, he went to Neil McNeil High School in East York and wanted to be, he played football there and hurt his knee. And that's kind of what got him into acting. And he wanted to play for the Argos. He really wanted, that was his boyhood dream, was to be an offensive lineman for the Toronto Argonauts. Didn't happen. And for him, he was so in love with the Argos franchise. He did things as an owner that players still talk about. He'd go on a road trip and he'd go out the day before. So let's say the Argos were playing in Regina on a Saturday night. He'd go out on the Thursday. He'd fly out on his own jet, do all of the radio, TV, interviews for newspapers, do everything, and urge people to come to the game in Winnipeg or Regina or whatever town I mentioned at the top. And then after the game, he'd say, hey, Coach Rita, give me 4 players who did really well. I want them to fly home with me. And they would fly home, and of course there was a private bar on the jet. And Candy just loved talking to players, and he wanted to sort of live out that boyhood fantasy of him being a player by hanging around with the players. And he'd stand on the sidelines, and actually at one point ran out onto the field to be with an injured player because there were 2 players injured at the same time. Trainers went to one player. Candy ran out to the other injured player. I think it was Carl Brazeley who looked up and went, I can't believe Candy's here on the field with me. The owner is here. Can you imagine Jerry Jones running out to help an injured Cowboy? Not going to happen. But John Candy was there with an injured Argo, and that made him so beloved to Argonaut fans. Anybody who remembers that team and is still an Argo fan cannot say a bad word about John Candy.
And when you just think about who he was as a person, as you just mentioned, and what the other things that he continued to do for the team, and just the camaraderie that existed, I was fortunate enough to have an opportunity to interview Adam Rita and asking him about the team, and him talking about how the management group made everything so smooth, and they made it easy for him as a coach, for the rest of the staff, the players, and you can just see it in all the footage. It's almost like the CFL version of The Last Dance, right? Like, not that they knew it was going to be The Last Dance with that group, but the way in which they were so captivating on TV, off TV, the news articles and outlets that they desperately wanted to swarm around the organization, around the club, or even just seeing how they were at practice or whatever it was. Like John Candy, even for the home opener, it was against the Tiger Cats, I believe it was. And at halftime, like Dan Aykroyd performing as part of the Blues Brothers, like that, again, also a super popular movie from the 80s that was just like a pop culture phenomenon. And the fact that, like, I mean, obviously John Belushi wasn't alive, but the fact that they got part of the Blues Brothers that they could get together to perform at a CFL halftime game, like that's just insane. Like, that is bigger. Like, Dan Aykroyd being there to CFL game at halftime performing is bigger than like many Canadian artists I could think of being at a halftime show of a regular season game, let alone even a Grey Cup.
Yeah, John Belushi had passed. His brother Jim actually played in the band that night. He came in and kind of took the John Belushi role with Aykroyd, and they were best known for wearing the dark sunglasses and the dark hats and black tie, black jackets. And John Candy came out wearing the Blues Brothers gear. with an incredible band. Like they grabbed guys who were just absolute pro musicians that formed that band. So it was a great band. And they had like that night, Martin Short, who was also on SCTV, he came up. And Candy had been in a movie with Marielle Hemingway. She ended up on stage as well, just kind of dancing around and having fun. And that was one of the things. Who's going to be on the sidelines this week? Who's coming? Is Gretzky going to be on the sidelines? Is he going to come with other players? Who's Candy going to bring this week? And there were always rumors about who was going to be there on the sidelines for an Argo game. And it made the team creep out of just the sports section, where to a degree it had been buried because the Blue Jays were so popular. They were really just coming into their own, into that great popularity on the verge of their two back-to-back World Series teams. So it got the Argos back a little bit more publicity in the summer, and it got into the news, like it would always be in the newspaper. Who's coming? The Toronto Sun. Who's going to be at the Argo game tonight? It was a ton of fun, and as you mentioned a couple of times, it wasn't just for the football; it was for the pop culture.
And the popularity of the Argos was continuing to grow with each and every passing week. You mentioned the curiosity of who's going to be at the game. And when you think about the context of Toronto sports history as a whole, the Argos are, yes, the oldest professional sports franchise club team like that in all of North America, that any history you trace back, the Argos were the very first. But when you think about how they've been overshadowed through different periods of time in the history of Toronto sports because of the Blue Jays, and obviously the MLB is massive, or when you think about the Maple Leafs having always been there, or then the Raptors coming into existence and all the different challenges the Argos have faced with attracting fans. But around that time, like the Blue Jays won back-to-back in 92, 93, and the Argos were still there. They were just able to get in on time and win a Grey Cup before the Blue Jays took over the spotlight. And even when you think about something like the Argo twist, for any person who's listening who would actually know what that is, or remember it, or have a parent who's old enough to remember that was like a small little piece, like a microcosm of this team's growing popularity week to week. Did you ever take part in the Argo twist, Mike?
Who didn't? I mean, that every team seemed to have one back then, right? It started with the '85 Bears with Walter Payton and Jim McMahon, and they were maybe the best team of my lifetime. And they did something called the Super Bowl Shuffle, and it was terrible. It was awful, but it was fun. Like, I mean, Bears fans went nuts about it, and I had all of the great players on that team with a really bad song, just kind of dancing around and having fun. And the Argos did one called the Argonaut Twist, and it was bad, but it was fun. And if you take stuff like that in the spirit in which it's intended, and don't look down your nose at it and go, oh, that's really ridiculous, and just have a good time with it, it really becomes an added experience of going to a live game. So yeah, everybody would kind of just get around and do the Argo twist or whatever, and it was dumb, but yeah, it was fun. It was a little bit of icing on an already sweet cake.
During that season, before the Grey Cup and the culmination of the playoff run that they had, what were your thoughts on the team's popularity within the city itself? And did you ever stop to think about if this had been the biggest that the Argos had ever been in your life, and or if you thought that this is the biggest that they ever could get because of how much popularity they were gaining?
I don't know if they were the biggest they ever were because, when the Blue Jays were just starting and were really bad, the same time in the late 70s, the Argos were really bad too. And I think that in the summer months and the fall months before the Leafs started, and obviously way before the Raptors were around, the sports fan was looking for something. They wanted one of those teams to do really well. And in 82, the Argos sort of came back from the dead and went to the Grey Cup, and you would sell out Exhibition Stadium, which was 40,000, 45,000. And that happened for a couple of years. They won the Grey Cup in 83. Town went crazy. And then there was a bit of a lull. So as the Blue Jays kind of in 85, when they won the division for the first time, started to take some of that popularity away from the Argos. The other thing that really hurt the Argos, and this sounds inconceivable, but the Chicago Blackhawks were doing this less than a decade ago, if memory holds true, but they were blacking out local games. So if the Argo game wasn't a sellout, you couldn't watch it. So there's a generation, probably now in their 40s and 50s, 30s, late 30s, who grew up wanting to watch Argo games, couldn't do it. And for home games, they'd have to watch road games and either listen to the game on the radio or buy a ticket to the game. And the theory behind it was, if the game's on TV, nobody's going to go to the game. So it was the owners that did this. It was a terrible idea. And I think that really hurt the Argos in this city for a long time with a lot of fans, because they just couldn't watch the home games. But, they were getting great crowds, and then the Blue Jays started getting 50,000 a game, and the Argos dropped off a little bit more. But in 91, as you mentioned, you could see the popularity growing, and the attendance was, it was huge for the opening game, and then it kind of petered out a little bit and then really started to build. And for the playoff game against Winnipeg, there were over 50,000 people there, and it was loud. And there are still those that think that's the loudest game they have ever seen, baseball or otherwise, at the Rogers Center. It was one of those games, and Rocket had a punt return touchdown in that game, and the place exploded. So, there was that. It was a fun place to be. Not the best building in the world for baseball or football or anything else, but the atmosphere was good because the fans were getting into it.
And you were at that game?
I was not at that game. I was not in Toronto on a full-time basis, but I watched that game at home. But I've talked to people who were there, and the atmosphere in that game was apparently just unparalleled. I think of the playoff games when Doug Flutie was here. One was a blowout. The other one was a last-minute win by the Argos, and that's the loudest I can remember that building being, with 40,000 Argo fans. I can't imagine another 10,000 going nuts in there, because it was so loud in 97.
I think, for the record, when I look back through the history books, the 91 Eastern Final against Winnipeg at the Sky Dome is the most well-attended game in the history of the building that is not a Grey Cup, because the only one that beat it out was the 100th in 2012 when they beat the Stampeders. But that, I was looking at the records of all the most well-attended games ever and was thinking, 50,000 in an Argos game now is inconceivable. Like, if there was 50,000 people, it'd be people hanging off the rafters at BMO Field. But you look at, yes, Olympic Stadium, obviously, because it was way bigger, and the Alouettes held way more. Commonwealth, same deal. And BC Place holding a few. But Exhibition Stadium, like you mentioned, the popularity of the team in the early 80s, 82, 83, 79, 78. A lot of those years are up there in the top 10, top 20 most well-attended games in CFL history because of the size of Exhibition Stadium and because of that resurgence of the Argos. When like you mentioned, they want something to do in the summer. The Blue Jays aren't really doing that well right now, but as the landscape changed, it also had a bit of a lingering effect, as we've seen in the Argos, because the team hasn't really been able to capture that same essence since 91.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that hurt was the way that the NFL exploded. And this may freak you out, but in 50 years ago, 1970s, early 70s, there were players who would come to the CFL because they were making more money than they would in the NFL. It wasn't until the TV contract exploded in the 70s, and then especially in the 80s, that everything just took off. And you think about that $1 million contract we were talking about with Jerry Rice. Now, what would he be making? 30 million? 25 million easy.
Christian Kirk just signed for 20 million today. So yeah. So Jerry Rice. You look at the money that was not available in the NFL back then. So you were seeing a lot of premier All-American college players who were coming to Canada because they were going to be paid more than they would be in the NFL. And we got first-round draft picks coming up to the CFL was not an uncommon occurrence. And a lot of them were just built better to play in this game, maybe a little lighter, a little faster, to take advantage of the bigger field. And, when the NFL was on its way to becoming the bombshell that it is, and it's really tough on the CFL because it's the same sport. You talked about, the NFL dwarfs everything. It's not just the CFL. The NFL dwarfs every other sport in the States. Maybe the NBA has an argument, but it certainly dwarfs Major League Baseball now, and the NHL, and Major League Soccer, and basically everything else. NASCAR obviously has a big loyal following, but it's not the NFL. The NFL is the preeminent sports brand on this continent, certainly, and arguably worldwide. So people will compare the CFL to the NFL,
And even though you'll see at least half of the players on every CFL team have had an experience in the NFL, it's not the NFL. When the average fan couldn't sit in the stands and tell you why that player is not in the NFL. So it's frustrating, but I've gotten off on a tangent. I apologize for that.
Oh, no, not at all. Like that's a quintessential part of the impact that the NFL has had on the Argos and the rest of the CFL in the present day. All you see online is people slandering the CFL and finding the quickest way to point to all the things they're doing wrong. But where are the people that are saying, well, this is what we can do that will actually make it better? Oh, the people that are mentioning, the people mentioning, we probably shouldn't change the fundamental aspects of the game, like 3 downs or the size of the field, just to appease to American audience, because that's worked before many times. We saw how the World Football League blew up and was so successful by trying to copy the NFL. And same thing with the XFL. It was great. It wasn't just garbage football, and they totally had a great successful run and are still on television to this day. Same with the USFL. They didn't have to like fold or re-expand or come back a bunch of times or anything, right? Like, so it's very easy to copy the NFL and succeed as those 3 leagues, and the AAF as well. Can't forget to mention that.
Here's the thing that I will never understand. And I grew up loving both. I love the NFL. I love the CFL, and I love them equally. But if you go down to a hotbed in the United States, let's take Friday Night Lights in Texas. What do people do on a Friday night in a town in Texas? They go and they watch the high school team, and they love it. Is the high school team as good as the NCAA? No. But the same guy who's going to go to a game on a Friday night and watch a high school game is going to go and watch U of Texas or Texas A&M or West Texas State on the Saturday, and they're going to enjoy the game. Is it as good as the NFL? No, but they are going to enjoy the high school game as much as they enjoy the college game, and then they're going to go and watch the Cowboys or the Texans on the Sunday. And they're going to enjoy that game as much as they enjoyed the NCAA game, as much as they enjoyed the high school game. I don't know why we can't wrap ourselves around that. And the thing that we have as an advantage here is it's a different game. So not only do we get to embrace a different league, a different sport, a different level, but we get to embrace different rules, different strategies. And for a football geek like myself, I love that I can watch a game on a Friday night and think about things differently, strategically. And I'm an Eagles fan. I'll watch the Eagles on the Sunday and get as much enjoyment out of that because it's a completely different game. Viva la difference. I love that. And I don't know why more football fans in this market particularly don't jump at that idea, because I just love the fact that there is a difference and we can enjoy more than one level of football.
And one of the things that the Edmonton Elks organization has done, which I think other teams should hop on the train soon to do, is the football day, like tying amateur football with pro football, because there's too much of a disconnect between the two in this country. The only places where I've seen that there's a super strong relationship between university and CFL teams is like U of R and U of S are pretty strong with the Riders. Calgary with the Dinos and Stamps are probably the strongest, I would argue. And then the junior teams in Saskatchewan have the most pull to the professional leagues because of the fact that they are the best teams in the league, no doubt. But you look at the Golden Bears, they've been up and they've been down and back up and down, and it's gone like a heartbeat. And them being tied with the Elks is only good. It's not going to harm them. It's not like people are going out in droves to U of A games right now and they're conflicted as to where to go. And I was actually... for a school, what we have to do is we have to tweet regularly. And one of the threads I thought was great. I was like, oh, well, what would this scenario look like across the country? What would this look like in BC or in Saskatchewan? I mean, Saskatchewan, it seems so evident. Look at Toronto. Like there's York, there's U of T, Guelph is close by. You could McMaster is close by. You could McMaster and the Tiger Cats. I mean, not that the Tiger Cats need much of a fan base boost as it is, but there's so many options as to what to do. But like the fact that the two entities don't team up just makes it a little more difficult for CFL fans to be attracted, right? Like you got to find a way to do something. Yes, the other thing that's beaten to death is the Vanier Cup and the Grey Cup. Now, I'm not sure where you stand on that debate, but it worked well enough in 2011, and I don't see why it couldn't work well again. Apparently, because the Grey Cup is dead to some people, but I don't know. What do you think?
I think it can. I think the Vanier Grey Cup can work, but not in every market. It can work in Toronto. It can work in Vancouver, where you have, and this is going to sound dumb, but it's something a lot of people don't think of. We've got enough hotels here. When you go to Saskatchewan for a Grey Cup, like people have booked a year in advance for this year's Grey Cup, and a lot are not able to get a hotel in Regina, and there are places in Regina now who are charging $600-700 a night for a hotel room because they are so scarce. If you were to have another major event like the Vanier with players and with sponsors and with parents, and you could do it. So for a smaller, it's tougher in a smaller market. But yeah, you mentioned 2011 in Vancouver with a great Grey Cup game and an even better Vanier Cup. The same thing for McMaster Laval in 2012 here in Toronto. I think it was 38,000. It might even be more than that came out for the Vanier Cup the night before. It can work, but it has to be the perfect setting. And I don't think there are enough venues that could do that.
That's a fair point. And even with Winnipeg, like I've always said, it was so cool to see the Vanier Cup in Winnipeg, but at the same time, it wouldn't necessarily work with a Grey Cup as well, because people in Winnipeg care about CFL and the CFL, and they want to go to the game regardless. I knew when it was in Winnipeg in 2015, tons of people showed up, even though the Bombers weren't playing in it and they weren't even that good that year. So, and that ties into the other part of this is the first Grey Cup in Winnipeg ties back to our story of the 91 Argos, the very first time the Grey Cup was held in Winnipeg. And I think the second or maybe third city ever, because I don't know if Edmonton had it before Winnipeg. Maybe they did.
If you go way back, there were some smaller venues that had one, but it was almost every year it was in Toronto because it's where the media was. It was the big stadium, which was Exhibition Stadium. In the 50s and 40s, it was always at Varsity Stadium. It was the place to have the Grey Cup. But yeah, in terms of my lifetime, I think there was one in 72.
75 was Calgary. That was a
75 was Calgary.
Super snowy game.
72 was Hamilton. So it had moved around a little bit, but yeah, the first one in Winnipeg, and it also happened to be the coldest game in CFL history, at least a Grey Cup game in CFL history.
Everything surrounding that game, people talk about the weather. They talk about the kind of back and forth that Toronto and Calgary had that year, because they had lost, I believe, in Calgary to Doug Flutie. Or no, Doug Flutie was on BC, I believe. So they lost to Calgary in Calgary, and then they beat them again at home. And then they were going to play them again in the Grey Cup. So it was pretty even between them. And people were talking about the weather being a factor. So take me through what you remember from watching the 91 Grey Cup and leading up to the big game, because as we mentioned earlier, most well-attended game, that wasn't a Grey Cup at the Sky Dome / Rogers Center. They thumped Winnipeg, who were the defending Grey Cup champions, even though Dunnigan got hurt again, and the Rocket was hurt a little bit, or Pinball, I think, was hurt in that game. So there was a bit of uncertainty around what was going to happen to the quarterback position and the weather, and the Grey Cup being held in super freezing conditions for the first time in a long time. Take me through what you remember from the 91 Grey Cup leading up to the week and also the game itself.
Well, look, the biggest question was Matt Dunnigan's health. And this becomes maybe the most undertold story in Canadian football history and maybe in sports history. Matt Dunnigan had a broken collarbone on his throwing shoulder and played in the Grey Cup with it. He went out the day before, and Mike McCarthy's told me this story. A couple of guys have. They went into the ballroom of the hotel they were staying in Winnipeg the day before and said, "Here, Matt, throw the football." And he kind of went, "Ugh." And it went about 10 feet and just flubbed to the floor. And they shot him up with a painkiller. They froze the shoulder. And as the freezing took effect, can you throw it? And all of a sudden, Matt is rifling the football a little bit. So he ended up playing. A lot of players weren't, I guess, thrilled about that because they thought that Ricky Foggy, the backup, would give them a better chance of winning because he was healthy. And that wasn't a knock on Matt. It was just that Matt's got a broken collarbone. How's he going to do this? And Matt's numbers were not great in the Grey Cup, but he got it done. He threw a touchdown pass to Paul Masadi. There was a big Rocket Ismail touchdown that you remember. I think the first play offensively that Calgary had, or was maybe the first series, Ed Barry intercepted and took 50 yards for a touchdown. So, there was that thing leading up with Dunnigan's shoulder. And the other thing that I thought was the coolest thing was when they walked out before the game and they introduced the players individually. None of them had their helmet on. They all took it off, and you could see the steam from the cold weather and the body heat rising off them, and they all walked out with their helmet raised over their head, and they didn't run out to the introductions. They walked out one at a time, and it was like, okay, these guys are focused. They get it. This could be a really good afternoon. So the game itself was tremendous from an Argo perspective. Rocket was great. He had a fumble on a big return early before the infamous return the kickoff, and that game just after Calgary had scored a touchdown, obviously, and had cut the score to one lead and then to one score. And then Rocket returns that. It gets back to a 2-score game and essentially wins the game with the beer can being thrown at him at the end. It's just one of those quintessential Canadian stories. But you're right. There was so much Canadiana and so much CFL history coming out of one very cold Sunday afternoon in Winnipeg.
And even the sights on the sideline of John Candy and Wayne Gretzky and Bruce McNall, like bundled up in toques, like any person should be at a game at Canadians, or I guess Winnipeg Stadium, it was called back in 1991, on a cold, freezing, late November Sunday afternoon. And I remember seeing the highlights of that first as a kid, and I was like, oh, well, I mean, obviously the Argos are really good, and Matt Dunnigan, he played well, but I never knew about the injury troubles that he had. And even I was talking about this with a friend on the phone yesterday. We were talking about the tenacity of some quarterbacks in CFL history and how tough they've been. Matt Dunnigan's touchdown pass to Mazzotti, like at the end of the game, that wasn't just a check. Like he wasn't Charlie check down. Like he rifled that thing like 40 yards. That has to be one of the most impressive things I've seen a person like a pass completed as a professional quarterback. Maybe aside from Mike Riley playing against the Riders in week 1 this last year, when I actually glossed over the highlights. My friend told me, he's like, dude, you got to watch this over again. This guy was like throwing balloons and the receivers were still catching the ball. And I watched it and I was like, this is like Matt Dunnigan playing in the Grey Cup, but except the weather is just a little bit better. Like super impressive. And how it didn't end his career, which it could have, is also still super crazy to think about.
Yeah, Dunnigan he was like, I guess, on either side of the border. Think of Michael Riley, think of Aaron Rodgers, and the guys who get hit so often. And you go, oh, he's not getting up from that one. And he gets up from that one. And then he gets hit later in the game and you go, oh, he's going to be out for 3 weeks. And he just gets up and goes back to the huddle and is 100% for the next play. There are some guys like that. Matt was like that. He had a concussion problem toward the end of his career that eventually he had 2 in one game, and that basically retired him. But Matt was one of those guys who just would get hit and you'd go, oh, he's not getting up from that one. And sure enough, he got up. So it wasn't really surprising that he played through the injury the way he did, but it was still a superhuman effort for him to suit it up on that day. When a lot of quarterbacks, I think, would have said, I can't go. I just can't go.
And after the game, after it was all said and done, the confetti fell and the Argos were Grey Cup champions for the first time since 83, I think it was. And it was just a phenomenal, euphoric moment that was captured so well in the locker room. But the part of the story that people then have to continue to read is the aftermath with not only the team, the league, and what the state of it is today as compared to back then. The reason why I found this story so interesting in the first place is because of the macrocosm that it spells for the need for popularity, the need for spotlight. You can't just rely on plug and play through history. The CFL has had to look itself in the mirror many times over the last 2 years of having a canceled season, a shortened season, people questioning the moves of the commissioner and the global initiative and all these sorts of things. But the CFL, as we know, history repeats itself oftentimes, and the CFL was in a similar situation just a few short years later after this iconic Grey Cup win by the Argos, with the expansion into the U.S., the potential of bankruptcy. What parallels do you see between the way that the league recovered from their initial financial troubles in 94 and what the league can do to recapture the similar iconic elements of that 91 team, not only for the Argos, but for the league as a whole?
I think you stop marketing toward guys of my generation because we're already here, and we go hard after guys your age. And, everybody's got an easy fix for the CFL and the Argos. I wish I had a quarter for every time I heard, hey, you know what? Where's your Drake? Why don't you get Drake to come to the games? And it's like, for Drake loves the Raptors, right? That's an organic thing for him. That was a natural thing. If we got somebody else to be the John Candy, the Drake, that person who goes beyond sports, it would have to be natural, like it was for Candy, like it was for Drake. And I don't know who that is. And I don't know in this internet age if that's enough. But if we could find somebody like that who loved the Argos and, would be deemed that would be a cool thing to do because person X is going to the game. That might help, but then it's get guys like you and your buddies to go out to a game and find out how much damn fun it is to go to a live football game. We looked last year at, and I don't have any numbers to break this down, but just the eye test, we had more young people in the crowd last year than we've had in quite some time. Guys your age. Maybe it's a sports betting coming on board where they want to say, hey, let's go. We can put a few bucks down on different things in the game and some prop bets, and we'll go down, have a $5 beer and watch the game for $20. That's something now when people are looking with the price of rent in Toronto these days, when they're looking for something that's a little cheaper to do for a day out, you can do that. You can go with your buddies and get a cheap ticket, a cheap beer and a dog, and then, be home in time on a Saturday to go out that night. So it's a good pre-drink for a lot of people to go out and just go to the biggest outdoor patio in the city in the middle of summer. And that's, I think, what we have to do. It's not just plug and play. It's not just, as you mentioned, bring in person X and go, hi, I'm an Argo fan. Come down because it's cool now. That's not going to work. It's got to be somebody who gets out there and says, you know what, that's cool, or getting more influencers involved and to show that it's, hey, this is the cool thing to do right now. I'm here with my buddies. We're having a great time. You should come down and join us. And, we're up against a lot. We're up not only against the NFL in terms of football fandom, but we're up against the Jays. We're up against the Leafs. We're up against the Raptors. We're up against concerts. We're up against, the off-Broadway stuff that comes up here. And all of now the alternatives people have to take what is becoming an even smaller amount of disposable income. So we've got to kind of position ourselves that way to a degree and just let people come and find out for themselves that it's damn good football, which I don't think is appreciated nearly enough in this market. And yes, I'm a guy that loves the NFL. There are a lot of guys in the CFL who should be playing in the NFL, and there are some guys in the NFL who would not be great CFL players. So it's a different game, and I love both equally.
And that's a great point you mentioned with how people look towards Drake as a Raptors ambassador and how he boosted the league, boosted the NBA in Canada, but it was natural. Like, I grew up as a hardcore Raptors fan as a kid, long before the days of Drake, and people would make fun of me for being a Raptors fan. But now it's We the North, and what former jersey of a Raptors player is Drake going to wear this week, or who's wearing Del Curry in the finals, always teasing Steph Curry. Like, I remember the days of people saying, well, it's a team with a purple dinosaur, a red dinosaur. Like, that's ridiculous. And again, it's natural. So if if Justin Bieber shows up at an Argos game, all of a sudden, the news outlet's going to be all over it like crazy, but it's not like all of a sudden the Argos ticket sales are going to increase by 10,000%. Like, it has to be natural, like can't seem forced. So I think social media plays a role in that. And I know that the work that Adam and the rest of the crew do with the Argos is phenomenal. The CFL needs to continue to push content like that. Behind the R with Josh O'Connor has been fantastic. They've done such a great job. And even for people like myself or other friends of mine who are from the prairies, yes, we don't cheer for teams from Ontario because we're not from Ontario and we're from Winnipeg or Saskatchewan or Calgary. But you can't ever, you can't show love for your own CFL team without acknowledging that other CFL teams need popularity too for rivalries to matter. Like Harris going to the Argos, that'll stir up some trouble in the news. Like, Winnipeg fans are going to be all over that. Maybe there's not as many Argos fans who are going to be into that right now, but that back and forth can create some buzz. Or when other players leave to the Argos or to the Red Blacks, whatever it is, that rivalry is what makes it alive, right? Like the Riders before the 89 Grey Cup were like doing a phone-a-thon to save the team. And you'd think like, these are the most passionate fans in the CFL. How's this possible? But guess what? They did everything they could to keep the team alive because they wanted that rivalry. Yes, Toronto was very important for the business aspect, but for fandom, like Saskatchewan and Winnipeg are the most important because those are the two places where the CFL team is like at the forefront of their sports scene. And we may never see that in any other CFL market, maybe minus Hamilton because they don't have anything else, unfortunately. But that rivalry, I think,
too. They have Toronto and Buffalo, though. Like you say that, but people in Hamilton can drive half an hour and be in Buffalo.
That's true.
Or half an hour too, and 4 hours coming home from Toronto, depending on traffic. But there are alternatives, and Calgary had in the '80s had an SOS campaign, Save Our Stamps. The Ticats. I remember when I was working at the Fan, an offensive lineman he put himself on a billboard for a week. He literally sat on the platform on the billboard to help raise awareness to get a season ticket push for the Ticats. And a lot of Argo fans bought season tickets for the Ticats to make sure, and this is before Bob Young took over, to make sure that they could get to their next owner. And there is that passion. And I know some Ticat fans who have bought Argo season tickets. Same reason. They'll come to games and they'll cheer against the Argos because it benefits the Ticats. You're a Bomber fan. It would be like you moving to Regina, buying season tickets for the Riders and cheering against the Riders every game, right? You'd be popular in your season ticket area for sure, but you know what I'm saying. I mean, people who love the league love the league, and that's the thing. There was an old beer commercial that said those who like it a lot, and that seems to be what the CFL is. Those who love the CFL really love the CFL. We don't have a huge number in terms of fan base with the Argos, that core fan base and season ticket holders. But I defy you to find more passionate fans for a franchise than the Argo diehards. And it's kind of what we've been talking about. You get kicked enough, right? You get really defensive. And it's like, the Argos suck. Nobody cares about the Argos. Nobody watches the Argos. TFC would kill. The Raptors would kill most nights for Argo TV ratings. I mean, the TV ratings are good. Our job is to get them to get off the couch and come down to BMO Field, which is easier said than done. And hopefully when they get down to BMO, they have a really good time because the atmosphere with 15,000 in that building is huge. It's a loud building. Argo fans are crazy to begin with in the best possible way, and it makes it a fun environment. So that's a lot of the troubles that we're having now. Other teams they've got through it. We've just got to do it in a town with more distractions.
Absolutely. And just thinking about all these ways that they can just reach younger fans and realize like it is a fun time if you give it a chance. And I think betting is something you mentioned that will probably play a pretty key role in getting more young people involved, because in my class of 29 or 28 people, I'm the only person that loves the CFL. Not that that's a big surprise because most people are from the GTA, but some people have mentioned to me, oh, well, the CFL, like it's fun to bet on, or it's not as hard as other leagues because of less teams or XYZ. So the more that the CFL can exist, at least in the chatter and the murmurs of sports fans locations, then the better off the league will be slowly but surely to gain momentum, because it's hard to recapture the essence of the 91 Argos. They're a one of a kind. And as much as we love reminiscing, it's not something that you can replicate that easily. Like I said, take Ryan Reynolds and Connor McDavid, they collab. Like it's still not as much as John Candy and Wayne Gretzky at that time. Like it really isn't.
I don't even know who, Lowry would have been, I guess, the most popular. I guess it would be Austin Matthews is the most popular athlete in Toronto now. Yeah. And I don't know who the most popular local actor would be, like Ryan Reynolds from Vancouver. But to get somebody from Toronto, I don't know who it would be. But that's what happened. And it was a wonderful, wonderful season. The football was great. The personalities were huge. And the fact that we're still thinking about them, those of us who were lucky enough to see that season, that we still have such a fond place in our hearts for that 91 team, tells you everything you need to know. I think for a lot of Argo fans who remember that team, that season was their most favorite season of all, and that includes the Doug Flutie years or the Ricky Ray years, or even going back to 82, 83 and the Condredge Holloway years in terms of quarterbacks. I think that you would talk to people, and I don't know if it would be the majority, but a very, very good number of Argo fans would look at that team as being their favorite.
Mike, I want to get some final words from you as to your thoughts on what you want to see going forward for the Argos in the next coming years to regain popularity, and just your thoughts on the importance of the CFL's like existence as a whole in the city of Toronto.
I think we're fine in terms of existence. I think I've been hearing the CFL is dead since I was a kid. So, I guess this is the 50th anniversary of the CFL is dead. So happy anniversary, CFL. It's gone through some waves where it's been really popular and sometimes when it's been really bad. American expansion was not an easy era back in the 90s, you alluded to earlier. I think we've got nowhere to go but up. The Argos are obviously divided into two halves. There's the football operations side that deals with the team and the players and coaches, and there's the business operations half. And I deal more, I'm kind of that hybrid. I deal with both. And in one of our football operations meetings, and he's done it a couple of times, our general manager, the legendary Pinball Clemens, said, my mantra is to be the most boring team in the league. And everybody kind of looked at him. He said, oh, no, I want to do the right thing every time, to the point where it's boring, that everybody expects us to do the right thing every time, that we're not making big mistakes and bigger recoveries. We want to be, if we're here, we don't want to do this. We want to be up here all the time. And now, the tougher, I think Mike Clemens and staff have done an amazing job. And on paper, I think we're as good, if not better, than any team in the CFL heading into 2022. We went from 4-14 to winning the East Division and coming within 15 minutes of going to the Grey Cup. I think we can be better, and I think on paper we are a better team this year with the free agent acquisition. So it's going to be a fun team to watch, and that's one of the things that we can do to get people out. Nobody's going to come out and watch 4-14. So that half, I think, is in a really good spot. From a business standpoint, we're still trying to get there, and we are fighting a lot of things. We're fighting that, you talked about your class. We're talking about apathy, and sometimes hatred is a better thing than apathy because at least there's an emotion involved, right? And now we've got to give the people who don't care a reason to start caring, and that's not easy. We're going about it, I think, the right way in terms of really going after youth football. Maybe we're too late for the guys in their 30s and 40s. I don't think we're too late for guys your age. But for people your age and younger, I think that there's an opportunity here to really get a groundswell going. We have a partnership with Toronto Flag Football League where if the red team is playing the green team, every team has a big Argo logo on their jersey and their discounts to get into the games. Like, we're working with people who are actually playing the sport to get in. We're also really making a vested interest in attracting the new Canadian group, people who have not been in Canada before, who might be intimidated because 3 or 4 down football is not natural to them. It's something that's they haven't seen before. So we're reaching out to some of those communities. A couple of years ago, we brought a group of 300 Brazilians who had not seen football at the CFL level before. Football's wildly popular in Brazil. It's the number 2 sport now behind soccer. It's past basketball. It's past, other, volleyball, all the other sports down there. But CFL was something new. We brought 300 in one group. 30 of them bought season tickets. Like, they were exposed to it. They went, this is fun. And that's what we have to do, to get your classmates to come out to a game with an open mind, come out, have a couple of beverages, bet on the game if you have to, because that might help you learn about some of the players. And once you learn about the players, you start getting that emotional attachment, that psychological attachment to the team. And once you get that, you're going to be more likely to come and watch the game either on TV or come down to the game and watch it at BMO Field. So that's what we have to do. We've got to try and start to create that emotional bond that I think was lost for about 25 to 30 years in this city.
And that will
it ain't going to be easy.
Yeah, it's a heck of a task, but it is possible. And if there's any person at the helm of a CFL organization that can lead this change, it's none other than Michael Pinball Clemens. Is probably the best person suited for bringing a CFL team back to the top of its glory days. As we saw some 30 31 years ago, back in 1991, when two of the members of Canadian royalty at the time paired up with a crooked tycoon, in the words of Paul Woods, to bring together the greatest and most iconic Grey Cup championship team that the city of Toronto has ever seen. Mike, I want to thank you for having been on today's episode. I really enjoy talking CFL football with you and with any person that loves the CFL. And now I am grateful that I've had the first opportunity to speak with someone that is very knowledgeable with the Argos at extensive length. So you certainly won't be the last, but it was a great first experience. So I thank you for that.
My pleasure, and I hope to see you down at BMO Field this year.
Will do. I will be there. Don't you worry. July 4th, 7:30 Eastern, I will be there if you know exactly what I'm talking about. So
Argonauts.ca for tickets.
Absolutely. Make sure you go get your season tickets, single game tickets. Check them out. TorontoArgos.ca. If you have not seen a CFL game yet, it's never too late. And thank you to all listeners for enjoying today's episode with the play-by-play voice of the Toronto Argonauts and communications manager, Mike Hogan.